Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, let your mind drift into the secretive world of Joe Profaci, the so-called olive oil king, a man who built an empire that blended family, business, and the shadows of the underworld. As you close your eyes, imagine the quiet deals, the sacred vows, and the power held behind calm smiles. Before we begin, drop your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always love seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy sleeping stories of gangsters and forgotten empires, don't forget to subscribe and join our growing family. Now, relax and let the night unfold. A quiet gentleman who prayed, donated, and never raised his voice. Yet his name sat on charts and in case files for decades. That man was Joe Profaci. He was born Giuseppe in Villabate, a Sicilian town where family, faith, and prudence shaped daily life. Old country customs taught him how to keep his word and how to keep his counsel. The wheat fields and rocky hills outside Palermo fostered a rhythm he would carry forever. Steady steps, no hurrying, no outbursts. After the First World War, he looked toward the Americas like thousands of others. The United States, bursting with immigrants, had strict quotas by then, but in 1921, he made his way across the ocean and into New York. One more face in a crowded harbor of hopes and languages. He found early work and watched the streets with a shopkeeper's eye. Prohibition had turned alcohol into contraband and created a huge underground economy. Legal doors closed, illegal windows opened. In that bustle, he learned which neighborhoods needed what, which merchants were reliable, and who could be trusted to keep arrangements quiet. He hustled within the law where he could, and stepped beyond it when the profit proved irresistible, according to police and reporters of the day. He moved carefully, making sure each opportunity brought two returns: money and loyalty. Within a few years, he launched an importing business in Brooklyn. Olive oil, tomato paste, and other goods from Italy crossed the docks and went out to family groceries and restaurants across the boroughs. He dressed neatly, paid attention to presentation, and made his company look like a model of immigrant success. The image stuck. People began calling him the Olive Oil King, and the nickname followed him to every column inch. He used that respectable storefront to meet customers, host colleagues, and demonstrate that he was a businessman first. Behind the counter, according to long-standing law enforcement accounts, he also managed bookmaking income, protection collections, and shares in various rackets that threaded through Brooklyn's trades. He made friends in the Italian-American underworld, setting roots among Sicilian-born figures who valued discretion. Bootlegging built fortunes fast, and in the 1920s, it also built rivalries. He learned to survive by avoiding parades and refusing drama. Low profile became his shield. Even as he expanded his legitimate sales, he kept a separate ledger in his mind, the one of favors granted and favors owed. People who met him often remembered a calm presence, a measured voice, and a devotion to rituals of faith. He gave to churches, attended services, and presented himself as a family man who preferred dinners at home to late nights in clubs. By 1931, the city's criminal map changed. Two powerful factions had torn at each other in the so-called Castellamarese conflict, and when the fighting ended, a new order rose. A modern structure appeared, with a board to mediate disputes, a way to divide territory, and set rules that aimed to prevent chaotic bloodletting from ruining business. Out of that reshaping came a set of families headquartered across the city. He emerged as the leader of one, with Brooklyn and parts of Queens forming his base. The press would later call it the Profaci family. Insiders saw it differently, a private partnership bound by oaths, built around people he had known for years, with deep ties to fellow bosses in Manhattan and Queens. At the table of that new underworld council, he held a seat. His business methods reflected his personality. He preferred regular payments to wild scores, patience to noise. He encouraged a structure in which crew bosses and soldiers delivered tributes up the line. Some members later complained that he levied a strict monthly cut and called it charity. He made a show of routing some funds to religious causes, and those donations won him friendly mentions in parish bulletins and goodwill from clergy, who saw him as a benefactor. Law enforcement thought otherwise, framing those streams of money as a cover that softened his image while he accumulated power behind the scenes. He let the debate swirl and kept counting. On the street level, his organization moved into classic rackets: running numbers, games, operating illegal dice and card rooms, lending at high interest, and collecting protection from vendors and small businesses that feared vandalism or theft. The enterprise also found footholds in trucking, vending routes, produce markets, and the garment trade. These areas overlapped with the interests of other bosses, so the diplomacy he practiced at the council table mattered. He worked with neighboring families on shared ventures and tried to maintain equilibrium. When he wanted something, he rarely demanded it in public. He preferred to talk in kitchens and back rooms, to negotiate, to keep his voice soft while his terms stayed firm. In those years, his olive oil company thrived. He used his knack for logistics to make sure shipments arrived on time and payments circulated smoothly. A container that arrived intact, a driver who kept his route, a grocer who sold out each week, all those details signaled competence. The people working his legal businesses saw a hard-nosed boss who expected results and rewarded loyalty. City officials, hearing of his generosity toward local parishes and charities, sometimes shook his hand at events. At the same time, detectives kept tabs on his associates, hoping to link him to illicit profits. They heard complaints about his insistence on dues. They heard about quiet sit-downs to settle disputes. They also saw how cases against him failed to stick. Witnesses backed out or knew nothing. Papers were tidy. And he never boasted. He married and raised a family, and his relatives figured in his work. Trusted kin, including a brother and in-laws, appeared in his orbit as assistants or confidants. That tight circle formed an inner ring he could rely on when disputes flared or when opportunities appeared. He took summer trips, visited doctors discreetly when needed, kept his name out of gossip columns, and avoided photographs unless absolutely necessary. He had little taste for the flamboyance that brought police attention to more reckless figures. His power grew quietly. More stores on his delivery routes, more influence over supply chains, more leverage with middlemen who preferred a steady partner to a flashy one. Through the 1930s and 1940s, he was arrested here and there, questioned for hours, and released. Charges came and went: tax matters, conspiracy allegations, and gambling counts floated around him, yet courtroom outcomes favored him. Prosecutors could outline a pattern, but they struggled to produce cooperating witnesses from his inner circle. His routine never changed: a polite nod to reporters, a lawyer at his side, and an exit without spectacle. He stood as a contrast to louder underworld names who courted headlines. He wanted the city to picture a merchant with taste for church fundraisers, not a brawler with bright suits. His strategy paid off in business and in influence. When supervisors on the docks needed help smoothing a bottleneck, someone from his team knew whom to call. When a cafe wanted a dependable supplier, his trucks rolled in before dawn. When a gambling spot needed security, men answered without fuss. The line between legal and illegal profits blurred, but the system stayed disciplined. He expected his subordinates to deliver what they promised. If they failed, he did not rant. He replaced them with someone more reliable. If they succeeded, he granted them space to profit, so long as the agreed-upon share arrived on time. He cultivated alliances beyond his own city. He respected older bosses who favored business over spectacle, and he aligned with men who believed that meetings and votes could prevent costly street trouble. He kept up with events in other states, and his name appeared in the background of conferences where high-level lever matters were discussed. Some meetings ended in police raids, and his presence or representation at these gatherings drew questions from authorities. Whether he attended in person or sent a trusted deputy, those moments strengthened the consensus among investigators. He was a central figure, a pillar of the network, even if the public rarely saw him. As his wealth rose, so did the stories about his personal piety. Visitors described a private chapel on his property, an altar carefully maintained, religious statues brought from Italy. Those gestures shaded his image and endeared him to neighbors who saw him as a successful immigrant rooted in faith. He would present large checks at church events and quietly cover expenses for repairs or annual feasts. Parish priests thanked him from the pulpit, and he accepted the praise with a humble smile. Skeptics said these acts served as armor, a moral passport that blunted criticism. He ignored the debate and kept funding what he valued. Behind the serenity, pressure built. The organization grew large, and with size came tension. Some subordinates grumbled that the monthly take left them little. Others accepted the cost as the price of doing business under a cautious, enduring boss. He listened, nodded, and kept terms consistent. He believed that order required discipline, and that discipline came from tribute. He had seen what chaos looked like in the old wars, and wanted no repeat. That meant keeping revenue predictable, settling disputes quickly, and making examples quietly when someone broke a promise. Investigators heard of retaliations and removals. The public rarely did. He insisted that problems be handled away from street corners and taverns that drew attention. In a city with many rivals, he kept his family mostly intact through the mid-century. He avoided reckless expansions and planted flags only when the ground was ready. His influence included stakes in food distribution, betting spots, loan operations, and labor rackets that touched trucking lines and warehouses. He rarely appeared in photographs with fellow bosses, yet his opinion mattered. When matters reached the top table, he voted conservatively, favoring steady profit over risky campaigns. Men who didn't like him called him tight-fisted. Men who admired him called him reliable. Both agreed he outlasted many who had tried a flashier path. By the mid-1950s, national attention on organized crime intensified. Senate hearings aired tales from insiders, and news programs turned whispered names into household topics. He stayed off camera, but his title did not. Reporters spoke to police who named him a longtime power. Tax agents pored over his accounts. Federal prosecutors examined his importing company and suspected that income streams didn't match invoices. Indictments arrived, were fought, and sometimes fell apart. Because he had built a layered portfolio of legitimate businesses, he could point to contracts and purchase orders. That paper shield proved useful, while his legal team challenged government claims line by line. He lived by rules he had set early. Speak little, give often to the church, punish betrayal, and keep the enterprise diversified. He raised children who saw a provider and a patriarch, not a man behind headlines. He hosted family dinners, attended weddings, and cultivated a dignified manner that stabilized his world. He understood that appearances mattered. A tailored suit, a respectful greeting, a contribution to a school fundraiser, such gestures humanized him. Meanwhile, the machinery underneath him turned. Collections ran on schedule. Shipments moved. Partners were placated or pressured, and neighborhoods understood who quietly ran things. The city changed around him, but his methods didn't. He watched the post-war boom fill new apartment houses and widen highways. He used those changes to widen his routes. More restaurants meant more accounts for his importing business. More workers meant more borrowers for his loan operations. His crews found new betting clients in booming neighborhoods. He kept a ledger in his head of every area manager and every earner. He expected them to keep pace with the times while honoring the dues that fed the top. That insistence would later prove costly. For now, in the middle years of his rule, it sustained an empire that matched his temperament. Quiet, profitable, and bound by habit. Through all of it, he held to his core belief. That power endured when it stayed unseen. He never chased the limelight. He chose the back pew over the front page, the private deal over the shouted threat. Those choices kept him standing while others stumbled. They also left him with critics inside his own house who envied more generous bosses. He heard the whispers and stayed the course. With hands folded in church one morning and a ledger waiting on his desk that afternoon, he held the city in a smooth, almost invisible grip, content to let others make noise while he counted. The peace he built did not come from luck. It came from careful routines that he ran day after day. In the years after the war, he rose before sunrise, checked delivery notes, and read church bulletins with his coffee. He liked steady work. He liked deals that stacked up small and clean. In the back of the shop, men from the docks came with updates. Drivers talked about delays. A bookmaker reported numbers from corner stores. A man from the markets asked for help with a stubborn union steward. He listened to each one. He asked simple questions. He promised nothing he could not keep. That patience made people lean in when he spoke. It also made them careful when they thought of crossing him. His group earned money the old ways. Numbers games ran out of candy shops and newsstands. Card rooms opened after dinner in basements and behind storefronts. Loans went to small merchants who could not get bank credit. Collections came in on time, or someone paid a visit to remind them. In the wholesale trades, he pressed for contracts that looked normal from the street, but left his people with the advantage. He pushed into trucking lines that fed the garment centers and produce markets. Union officers learned that quiet cooperation meant smooth schedules and calm paydays. Investigators later tied names from his circle to these efforts, calling it labor racketeering. He said he was a merchant who liked order. The truth, as police and prosecutors wrote it, sat in the middle. A legitimate front that masked a machine. The 1950s changed the light on that machine. Televised hearings exposed the underworld to living rooms across America. Politicians hauled gamblers and fixers into hearing rooms and asked them to explain fortunes no one could trace. He did not sit at those tables. He had already made a rule for himself. Cameras were not his friends. He tightened his circle. Meetings moved to kitchens and gardens. Messages traveled by trusted men who knew not to speak more than needed. He kept giving to churches and schools. He stood in the back at public events, shook hands, and left early. He still could not avoid pressure forever. State and federal agents looked at accounts for his importing company and saw lines that did not match the neighborhoods they watched. They suspected that the clean business hid a dirtier ledger. A grand jury probed his taxes. Indictments followed on paper counts that said he had hidden income and filed false returns. He hired a seasoned lawyer, entered pleas, and sat through court dates in a dark suit, saying little. The cases moved slowly. Appeals and motions ate time. Health complaints led to postponements. Reporters waited outside court buildings hoping for a quote and got silence. One day in 1957, state police in upstate New York saw a long line of expensive cars on quiet country roads. Officers stopped the drivers and headed to a nearby property where a large outdoor lunch had drawn men from several cities. They wrote down names and license plates and asked hard questions. That gathering, later known to everyone as a turning point, showed how connected the network really was. His name appeared among those questioned. He explained that he had driven north to visit friends. Authorities did not buy it. The fallout spread fast. Pressure on his businesses, visits from agents, and headlines that used the word syndicate with his surname. He left the scene the way he always did, calm, guarded, and without a single remark that could be twisted in a courtroom. Inside his organization, the rules stood firm. Crews sent their monthly shares to the top. He called it order. People close to him called it dues. Critics called it a tax. Some members said he framed part of it as money for religious causes. He did give to churches. He did fund feasts and repairs. He also kept a sharp eye on who paid and who stalled. Anyone who fell behind heard from his lieutenants. If excuses piled up, a crew might lose territory. He preferred discipline to noise. That stance kept profits steady through most of the decade. It also built resentment that would boil over when patience wore thin. A Brooklyn earner named Frank Abitamarco ran one of the richest numbers territories in the borough. He had a long history under his boss and made a reputation as a heavy collector who liked to boast. Over time, his payments up the chain slipped. Warnings came and went. One day in 1959, he was gone, struck down in a hit that papers called the end of a policy king. Police looked at his boss. The boss said nothing. Men in the crew that had expected to inherit Abitamarco's roots did not get them. Instead, the most valuable lines were handed to older captains linked by marriage or decades of service. That decision burned like a coal in the hands that had done the work. The crew that felt slighted was run by the Gallo brothers in South Brooklyn. They were younger, hungry, and eager to be seen as more than street earners. They had carried out orders and expected a reward. When it did not come, they grumbled, then plotted. To them, the problem was not only money, it was respect. Their frustration built into open defiance. They refused to send full payments. They held back counting sheets and balked at demands they called unfair. The boss treated those moves as a challenge to his authority and told his men to hold firm. He had survived long enough to know that if he yielded once, he would face constant tests. In early 1961, that standoff erupted. Members of the Gallo group grabbed several trusted men from the other side and held them. The kidnappings shook the city's underworld. The families usually avoided public drama. This was different. It was a direct shot at the boss's credibility. The captors demanded money and territory in exchange for safe returns. The boss did not call the police. He sat with advisors, weighed the risks, and sent emissaries to talk. He offered terms to end the crisis, including a promise to ease some monthly demands. The hostages came home. The city relaxed. Then, according to accounts from both sides, he pulled back the concessions and resumed business as usual. He had never liked being told what to do. That reversal pushed the feud into a longer, uglier phase. Gunmen looked for targets. Cars were followed. Homes were watched. People changed routes to work and back. Because he hated messy scenes, the boss pushed for quiet hits that would not spray headlines. The other side wanted noise. They wanted the whole city to know they would not bend. One of the most talked about incidents came when a senior member of the Gallo crew was lured into a meeting at a neighborhood bar. A group tried to choke him into silence. A uniformed officer walked in by chance and stopped it. The man staggered out, lived, and the feud hardened. Investigators tied key figures from the boss's camp to the attempt. One of them, a clever street figure who knew both sides well, would later gain a lasting nickname for switching loyalties more than once during the clash. Through it all, the boss stuck to his routine. He rose early, went to mass, checked invoices, and worked the phones. He moved between Brooklyn and a winter home in Florida when the weather, and later his health, pushed him south. Federal agents tailed him. Local detectives collected names of visitors and tried to flip small players who needed a break. He stayed calm, let his lawyers file papers, and reminded his captains that quiet made money and noise brought raids. That message carried weight with older men who had seen the old war. It made younger earners bristle. They watched other families allow more profit to stay in the crew. They compared notes and grumbled. He nodded and kept his percentage. The more the dispute with the Gallos dragged on, the more the city read about him. Newspapers described him as a gentleman farmer with a rosary and a wide network of businesses. They also printed police claims that he taxed his members hard and used church donations like a cloak. Both pictures served him. Admirers saw a devoted family man who supported parishes and schools. Rivals saw a stickler who would not loosen his grip. He accepted both labels and made no attempt to fix them. He understood that public debates about his character did less damage than evidence would. He avoided the kind of talk that created evidence. His inner circle stood tight. His brother managed business matters. His brother-in-law, Joseph Magliocco, worked as his deputy and handled delicate meetings. Sons and nephews stayed near the family holdings, learned logistics, and kept household matters simple. Weddings, baptisms, and feast days filled the calendar. Neighbors waved to him on his block. Priests shook his hand. He carried this domestic calm like a shield. In public, he looked like a merchant and a benefactor. In private, he managed a web that reached from butcher shops to warehouses, from truck yards to card rooms. By now, he had seen every kind of case land on his desk. A hijacked load, a scared store owner, a careless gambler, a union steward, asking for help. He handled each one with the same approach. Listen, bargain, decide. Government pressure never really eased after the upstate raid. Agents watched the waterfront. They checked union elections. They compared customs paperwork to delivery routes. They sat in unmarked cars outside his home and hoped a microphone would pick up what a human ear could not. In those years, prosecutors often tried to hit bosses with tax cases because other charges were harder to prove. He received more summonses. He posted bond, answered through counsel, and kept his schedule. He said he was ill when he had to be in a hospital. He produced doctor's notes. He won delays. He never raised his voice in a courtroom. The feud with the Gallos did more than threaten profits. It threatened his style. He had built his rule on quiet and predictability. An open challenge by a younger crew threatened to pull the whole city into a spiral. To fix that, he turned to what had always helped him most: talks. He asked allies in neighboring families to urge calm. He sent word that he would meet some demands if the younger men stopped the show. More than once a ceasefire sat on the table. More than once it fell apart. One side insisted on more room and lighter dues. The other insisted on order first, concessions later. Each time a handshake came close, a street incident ruined it. By 1961, age and illness began to slow him. He had stomach trouble and pain that sent him to doctors again and again. Friends urged him to rest in Florida. He made trips south, swam in the mornings, and tried to recover. Even then, he kept in touch. Calls went out. Letters were handy-carried. Visitors flew down with reports. The machine kept running. He had built it to run, no matter where he. Saturday. Brooklyn still moved product. Markets still opened. Crews still made their rounds. And yet, the younger men at the edges saw his weakness and pressed harder. They wanted a new deal under a new hand. He resisted the notion. He had weathered pressure for decades and believed he could outlast this storm too. The city's other powers watched and waited. Some thought he would shake loose the problem by granting a little and saving the rest. Others thought he was too rigid. Still others worried that any sign of weakness would invite copycats in their own houses. That made outside help scarce. He had allies, but no one wanted to be seen taking sides in a house fight. He relied on his deputy to keep captains in line and to keep business flowing. He focused on what he could control. Shipments, accounts, meetings with priests and neighbors. In his mind, the best answer to a revolt was proof that the top still delivered calm and profit. Even as the feud tugged at his edges, he grew in the ways that could be counted. His company posted sales. His stores stayed supplied. His home life kept the stability he prized. He received guests with a gentle smile and a straight back, even when pain forced him to sit sooner than he once did. At church, he bowed his head and crossed himself with the same steady hand that had held ledgers since his first days in Brooklyn. Those close to him say he believed he would resolve the mess the way he had solved every problem. One meeting at a time, one agreement at a time, making sure no one saw him sweat while the city held its breath. Pressure can make men improvise in ways they never planned. After the hostages came back and the city exhaled, the two sides watched one another with a new edge. Cars idled down side streets. Men who had once shaken hands across card tables now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Detectives picked up more whispers than facts. The older captains advised patience. Younger earners wanted a show. In that mix, a few ambitious figures tried to rise by playing messenger and mediator at once. One name repeated in reports was a sharp young street figure who could smile on one corner and scheme on the next. He spoke to the gallows with one tone and to the old guard with another. Allies found him useful. Enemies learned to keep their pockets zipped and their promises in writing. Years later, that approach would give him a nickname that stuck. The most famous close call of that feud unfolded in a quiet lounge where conversations usually stayed inside the walls. A sit-down had been arranged, the kind of talk meant to cool tempers. The meeting turned into an ambush. Hands went to the throat of a leading man from the rebel side. He fought silently for air. Then the door opened, and a uniformed officer stepped into a scene he never expected to see on patrol. Startled faces, quick excuses, and a retreat saved the target's life and hardened a street legend. The attempt proved two things at once. The old boss still had reach, and the younger crew would not forget. The city heard about it within hours. Newspapers didn't print gory details. They didn't have to. The image of a rescue in the nick of time was enough to send a message to every corner social club. The gallows answered with stubborn defiance. They refused to send in full shares, skipped meetings, and held back on jobs that had always been routine. They wanted terms rewritten, routes restored, and the monthly cut trimmed. The boss would not bend. He had survived decades by being consistent. If he let one group dictate terms, he believed the whole structure would wobble. He sent envoys with simple offers. Pay what you owe, keep the peace, and leave the rest to me. The replies came sharp. Give back the routes we took risks to build. Ease the tax. And show respect. Each time a truce sat on the table, a flare-up spoiled it, broken windows here, a chase there, a burst of tires gone flat in the night, and the city's rumor mill churned again. Police and federal agents took every chance to apply pressure while the feud dragged on. They knew open conflict created informants. They made arrests on gambling counts, truck hijackings, and tax violations tied to small shops where number slips changed hands. In that climate, one of the most active Gallo leaders faced an extortion case that brought a stiff sentence. He went upstate, traded street corners for steel bars, and left his brothers to keep the flame. That single event slowed the war more than any meeting could. Without its loudest strategist on the sidewalk, the rebel faction lost momentum. The boss saw an opening. He told his captains to slow their hearts, keep the money coming, and avoid headlines. For a time, the streets cooled. The old man felt age settle on him while all this moved around him. Stomach pain nagged. Doctors said to rest. He flew south in winter and stayed near warm water when the wind cut through Brooklyn. In Florida, he kept a careful routine: short swims, light meals, long phone calls. Visitors brought news. Some came north lighter in the pocket and heavier with advice. He listened, weighed every word, and sent them back with instructions. He was not the kind to lie on a lounge chair and let the world spin. Even while ill, he checked invoices and shipments, scanning for any pattern that might hint at weakness others could exploit. Tax agents stayed on him. They compared company receipts to the lives they saw his lieutenants living. They prepared grand jury presentations and drew up indictments that accused him of underreporting income and hiding profits behind layers of paper. He came to court with a quiet step, a good lawyer, and a folder of medical notes. He sought adjournments, filed motions, and kept his answers clipped to yes and no. Years of practice had taught him that talking was a luxury he could not afford. Some counts were dismissed. Others hung over him, moving slowly from month to month. The government wanted a clean victory to show the country that old-world bosses could be cornered by accountants, if not by detectives. He wanted time. Within his house, resentment did not vanish. The dues policy still rubbed hard. Men on the street said the monthly charge felt like a second landlord. They said he used church envelopes like a shield and called the money charity. They remembered the orphan fund speeches and the visits to parishes where he handed over checks with a soft smile. Some believed in the cause. Others saw cosmetics. He did not explain himself. He told his men that order came with a price, and that price kept lawmen off doorsteps and rivals out of neighborhoods. For years, that argument held. It was holding now, but barely. He had never forgotten that the underworld was a federation, not a monarchy. So he tended to alliances. He kept close to conservative bosses, who liked meetings more than muscle. He favored the Sicilian Old Guard, men from the same island terrain that had shaped him. One of those allies, a softy-spoken leader with a bookish presence and a long view, stayed in touch throughout the turmoil. They shared a wish to keep the post-war order steady, to stop headlines from scaring businessmen who preferred quiet supply chains. In private, those two would later be tied to an audacious plan that aimed to restructure the top by force. That story belonged to the years after the old man left the stage. But the roots sat in these conversations. At home, his routine never changed much. He rose early, fingered a rosary, greeted his wife, traded jokes with grandchildren, and stepped out in a tailored jacket even on ordinary days. Visitors saw an open dining room, photos from Italy, and a small chapel that glowed with candles. Priests who knew him spoke with gratitude about repairs funded and new statues ordered. To them, he was a benefactor, an immigrant who had never forgotten the parish system that welcomed families from across the ocean. He didn't argue with that picture. He let it be. The men who came after dinner for a word about trucking contracts or union votes saw the rest of him. They knew he counted every dollar and remembered every promise. By the spring of 1962, illness returned hard. Regardless of willpower, the body has its own math. He went to a Long Island hospital and spent more days under watch. His inner circle kept the shop fronts open, the routes running, and the envelopes moving upstairs. Captains asked what would happen if he stopped coming home. His deputy calmed them and asked for patience. Visitors were screened. Only the most trusted were allowed near the bed. The old man still worked the phones when he could, voice low, questions short. He asked about deliveries, feuds, and the tempo on the street. He reminded his people that the world loved a rumor, and rumors kill revenue. He died that June with family near, the rosary he had carried for decades now in the hands of his wife. News spread fast. Reporters gathered at the church he had supported for years and filmed the sidewalk before the funeral mass. Uniformed officers stood back and took notes on every face that walked through the doors. Men from across the city arrived in dark suits, greeted one another quietly, and found pews near the back. Priests spoke of charity, family, and the life of a parishioner who had given generously. No one mentioned the dossiers in police lockers. No one had to. In New York, the two stories often sat in the same pew. The burial came the same day at a mausoleum in Queens where many prominent families had plots. Detectives watched in silence as wreaths went by. The coffin slid into a marble wall, and the crowd thinned. After years of living without headlines, he received the most public farewell of his life. That irony would have amused him. He had built an identity around modesty, routine, and long patience. He had preached the value of keeping the temperature low and the door closed. At the end, cameras and notebooks made him a front-page subject he never wanted to be. His estate revealed the dual life he had carried so carefully: a reputable importing firm with warehouses, vehicles, brand contracts, and a broad client list, properties in New York and Florida, the chapel he had maintained, and business interests in markets and trucking. Lawyers handled probate while investigators compared notes, looking for gaps they might have missed when he was alive. They found less than they hoped. He had not been careless. He had insulated himself behind layers of managers, contracts, and cousins who knew the value of saying little. Control of the organization passed to his closest deputy, a relative by marriage who shared his conservative style and had sat at his right hand for years. This choice followed the pattern of the time. Keep the old guard in place, smooth the transition, and let the business run. The younger rebels saw that announcement as a message that nothing would change. They gritted their teeth. Other bosses in the city accepted the new arrangement and moved on. They preferred continuity over chaos. For a few months, the temperature stayed just below a boil. The vacuum left another effect. Without the man whose quiet authority had steadied the table, rivalries that he had managed with small corrections began to jerk. Old grudges stirred. Old dreams resurfaced. The ally from out of town, the bookish conservative with his own empire, saw a chance to redraw lines at the top. He and the new head of the Brooklyn group discussed a plan that would, if successful, lift them both. The plot called for removing two of the most powerful men in the city. To carry such a scheme, they needed a trusted soldier who moved well in both legitimate and underworld circles, someone young, ambitious, and eager to prove loyalty. The man they picked chose a different path. He went to the wrong audience with the tale, and the plan collapsed before it began. The fallout would shape a new era and put a fresh name on the Brooklyn family's letterhead. Looking back at the old man's life from that turning point, certain themes stand out. He built through patience rather than force. He chose a clean public trade to cover a sprawling web of hidden income. He insisted on regular tribute and used religious generosity as both faith and armor. He forged alliances with men who valued order and kept his distance from the loudest figures of his day. He avoided impulsive expansion and treated risk like a hazard, not a thrill. Those choices created stability. They also cultivated resentment among younger men who wanted faster gains and lighter levies. His story is one of control exercised behind the curtain, of power earned by showing restraint rather than volume, and of a reign that endured through some of the wildest decades the city ever saw. Residents of the neighborhoods where he moved still remember the duality. Grocers who bought his olive oil talk about a supplier who never missed a delivery. Parish volunteers remember a donor who covered repair bills without asking for a plaque. Detectives remember a boss who dodged cases because he understood process and patience. Street men remember a leader who demanded prompt envelopes and offered protection in return. That balance carried him for 4 decades. It ended only when age and illness took what rivals and prosecutors had failed to take. In the quiet that followed, New York's underworld turned a page, and the city braced for a new round of troubles that would sprout from seeds he had planted and rules he had written. His passing did not stop the rhythm he had set. The morning after the funeral, trucks still rolled before dawn. Warehouse doors still clanged open, and men who knew his habits still arrived early with notebooks and cash envelopes. The structure he built depended on routine, not on one voice. That was by design. He had taught his people to honor schedules, follow a chain, and keep the money neat. He believed that order survived when it was baked into the day. For a time, that lesson held. His brother kept the book steady. His brother-in-law, Joseph Magliocco, stepped into the top chair and assured captains that nothing would change. Dues would come in, markets would stay covered, trucks would keep their routes. The message was continuity, because continuity meant profit. The family's public face did not falter. The importing firm continued to supply grocers and restaurants, and invoices moved at the same pace as before. Priests still thanked the household for help with parish projects. Reporters, hungry for a shift in style, found the same low-key approach. There were no flamboyant parades, no new social club openings, no bravado. The new head had spent years at the old man's right hand. He favored calm rooms and careful words. He kept the tribute system intact, a decision that pleased traditionalists and irritated restless crews who had hoped for a break. The uneasy truce with the Gallo faction limped on. One brother was still upstate on a long sentence, which took the edge off the street. The others watched and waited. They sent in money, though not happily, and nursed old grievances about roots and respect. The new boss stayed firm. He believed, as his predecessor had, that a steady levy kept the enterprise disciplined. He had no interest in renegotiating under pressure. Quiet profit was the point. Emotion was a cost center. That posture had worked for the old man. Whether it would work now, without his personal gravity, was the open question. Outside the borough, bigger currents started to shift. The National Council that had been created after the old war still existed, and its members were aging into a new set of concerns. Two figures stood tallest at that table: a cunning, steady leader in Manhattan who had gathered influence mile by mile, and a brilliant, patient organizer in the Bronx and Queens, whose reach grew with each passing year. That balance nagged at men who felt left behind. One, a bookish, serious Sicilian with a deep base of his own, wanted a rebalancing. He spoke often with the new Brooklyn boss. Both men admired the quiet style, both considered themselves traditionalists, and both believed the commission could tilt too far if they stood still. In whispered talks, an audacious plan took shape. The idea was simple on paper and dangerous in practice. Remove the two most powerful men at the top and reset the board. To carry it off, the plotters needed a loyal emissary who could approach targets without raising alarms. They chose a young captain who had gained favor by staying industrious and respectful, while the older generation ran things. He had grown his crew's income, learned how to talk to business owners and union figures, and presented himself as a modern earner with old-fashioned manners. He was supposed to be the blade in a velvet glove. Instead, he took the plan straight to the intended victims. He described the proposal and the roles assigned to him. The deception was clean and fast. The two powers now knew they were marked, knew who had volunteered, and could set the terms of punishment. The council summoned the new Brooklyn head. There were no shouting matches, just deliberations and a verdict that fit the institution's need for stability. The commission fined him and asked him to retire. He agreed, bowed out, and went home. Within months, he died of natural causes, his time at the top short and tense. The other plotter faced his own reckoning. He fled the city, leaving a vacuum that would soon pull in investigators and cause his empire to fracture. And the emissary who had told the tale? He received an extraordinary reward. With the ascent of the top table, he took over the Brooklyn family. Overnight, the old name faded. The press began calling the organization by the new boss's surname. Within a year, every paper had swapped the tag. The family the old man built was now known by someone else's banner. That change stamped his legacy in two opposing ways. On the one hand, his methods had proved sturdy. The system of dues, the marriage ties, the investment in unions and markets, those building blocks stayed. On the other hand, his personal brand, the one the city had repeated for decades, slipped from the masthead. The new leader liked public causes and photo opportunities. He formed civic groups, shook hands at rallies, and appeared on television as a spokesman for a neighborhood coalition. That was the opposite of the old man's approach. He had avoided microphones and relied on whispers in kitchens. Watching the family he founded step into camera light would have puzzled him. History, though, remembers patterns. When investigators retraced the arc of the Brooklyn group, they kept finding the elder's fingerprints on the foundation. He had grafted his sense of structure onto everything: how captains reported, how union bridges were maintained, how trucking lines were divided, how introductions worked when a new earner wanted a piece of a market. He had also set the habit of diversification. If a gambling spot closed, a vending route expanded. If a loan shark's book thinned, a new supply contract filled the gap. That flexibility had kept the family strong. It kept them stable now, even as leadership and labels changed. Reporters returned to the earliest chapters and filled in details about his climb. They looked at passenger manifests from 1921, at Ellis Island records, at naturalization papers, at incorporation dates for the importing company. They wrote about the timing of his rise during Prohibition and the way he used a legitimate trade to cover lines of income that ran on different ledgers. They described how, during the violent reshuffling in 1930 and 1931, he kept his head down and emerged as one of the 5 recognized heads when the smoke cleared. They noted his attendance at gatherings meant to reduce chaos: summits in hotel suites, dinners in back rooms, the infamous country estate meeting where police wrote down license plates by the dozen. Through it all, he had kept talking to a minimum and wore the same restrained suit. Law enforcement summaries from that era read like a catalog of the old city's rackets. Under his umbrella, crews handled numbers games out of candy stores, illegal dice and cards in basements, loans to small shopkeepers at rates that forced punctuality, insurance against accidents to windows and trucks, and slices of labor influence that touched the garment district, produce markets, and ports. Some accounts tied his circle to licit industries whose books hid quiet pressure truckers steered to certain routes, foremen nudged toward preferred vendors, union votes tilted under the weight of dues envelopes. Detectives called it racketeering. He called it order. Courts struggled to translate rumor into proof. The government's best shots came through tax counts. In the mid-1950s, indictments accused him of hiding income and underpaying the Treasury. He fought the cases with experienced counsel and a steady stream of medical notes that documented stomach problems and operations. Judges granted continuances. Hearings split and reset. Years passed while different parts of the case crawled forward. When reporters asked for comment, he offered none. Men who lived on talk shows in that period could not understand the strategy. He did not need to. He believed silence was armor. His private piety remained one of the most discussed traits in his profile. Visitors described a personal chapel glowing with candlelight. Parishioners remembered large checks presented without speeches. He joined religious fraternal groups, supported feast days, and took pride in the care of statues imported from Sicily. Supporters saw generosity and devotion. Critics inside his house complained that he framed internal levies as charity to blunt criticism and make dissent look like disrespect for faith. Both could be true at once. He believed in ritual and saw public devotion as a shield. That paradox defined him more than any arrest did. The Gallo conflict, a wound he had tried to cauterize with patient talks and quiet pressure, outlived him. It flared again under the new leadership, then simmered, then flared once more as younger men chased headlines. One lieutenant from the old days, clever, coiled, and ambitious, played both sides during the first phase of the feud and earned a nickname that followed him for life. He would later rise high and then face the full weight of federal cases. His path told a story about generational change. The old man had prized constancy and measured steps. The next wave prized movement. That difference drove much of the city's underworld into the late 1960s and 1970s. For people who lived in his neighborhoods, the memories are tactile. The smell of tomatoes and oil in the warehouse, the sight of clean trucks lined up on a narrow street, the quiet nod he offered to neighbors on his block, the hushed greetings inside a parish hall. For men who work the rackets, the memories are ledger lines, the fixed percentage, the schedule of collections, the rules about who could open a game and where. For detectives, the memories are surveillance photos and long nights in sedans outside social clubs. Each group saw a different man. The sum of those views is the truest picture we have. After his death, families in Sicily sent letters of condolence, and distant cousins visited New York to pay their respects. He had maintained ties to Villabate and Palermo, sent money back for church projects, and invited relatives to see what he had built. Those exchanges kept his roots alive. He saw himself as a bridge between places, an immigrant who had carried habits across an ocean and adapted them to a new economy. That self-image mattered to him. He took pride in his discipline and his ability to surround himself with kin who understood the value of a kept promise. The estate proceedings showed careful planning. Properties were titled cleanly. Business interests were managed through corporations whose paperwork matched. Vehicles were registered properly. He had paid lawyers and accountants to tighten every bolt he could. That left prosecutors with little to tear apart. Some small penalties emerged. Nothing like the sweeping seizure some had hoped for materialized. Part of that result came from the fact that he had never chased the worst temptations of the era. He did not buy nightclubs with neon signs. He did not build a gambling palace. He invested in warehouses and safe stock. Assessing his place in the city's underworld, historians often point to three traits. First, durability. From the early 1920s to 1962, he stayed relevant, outlasting men who had louder reputations. Second, a blended portfolio of legal and illegal income that confused investigators and steadied cash flow. Third, a devotion to routine and ritual that shaped everything from his days to his diplomacy. These traits explain why his organization survived him. They also explain why some subordinates grew frustrated. A system that prizes predictability can feel stifling to those who want to rise fast. The rebels who challenged him spoke that language. He heard them and stayed the course. In quiet moments at home, he watched grandchildren play and listened to Italian spoken in two accents, the old country and the Brooklyn street. He enjoyed those sounds. They reminded him of the distance he had traveled and the balances he had kept. Between faith and profit, between law and lawlessness, between public respectability and private command. As illness took more of his strength, he kept those balances in his head. He believed that the ledger he had tended for decades would stay balanced after he was gone. In a narrow sense, he was right. The business kept working. In a broader sense, the ledger recalculated without him. New taxes of pride and ambition were added to the page, and the math changed. The last measure of any leader is not ceremony but the habits that outlive him. In the years after he left the scene, his habits remained. Captains still reported on a schedule. Markets were still treated as trust assets, not personal fiefdoms. Money still flowed up and down in predictable streams. When storms came, indictments, raids, feuds, the organization fell back on the very routines he had drilled into it. Meet quietly, count carefully, settle quickly. The headlines came and went, the family name changed, and the city moved on. Yet under those moving parts sat his blueprint, the unflashy set of rules an immigrant from Villabate carried across the Atlantic and turned into a long, steady hold on a piece of New York. The new label on the Brooklyn Group did not erase the story of the man who built it. People who had known him for decades kept telling versions of the same scenes, the same choices, because those choices kept showing up in the city's later headlines. When the commission blessed the young emissary and let him take the chair, the newspapers switched the family name to match his. That rename made sense for headlines, but when detectives mapped the rackets, the number spots in candy stores, the gambling rooms behind storefronts, the loan books kept in neat hands, the footholds in trucking and produce, they still traced the lines back to the habits the old man had drilled into his crews. Even the fights that broke out under the new boss carried the old stamp. The grievance over dues and respect, the tug-of-war over territory after a major earner's death, the belief that rules had to feel fair in the places where money was collected. Those themes all began on the old man's watch. He had insisted for years that a fixed take from each crew kept order. Older captains agreed because they liked predictability. Young earners called it suffocating. The Gallo quarrel started there, and even after the new boss took over, that quarrel kept echoing. One brother was still serving time. The others tested the edges of the new order. They pushed for concessions and tried to use the transition to gain leverage. They found that the policy the old man set had outlived him. The new head echoed it. The commission favored it. The temperature rose again, then fell when pressure from outside forced a pause. In the background, another storm gathered. The plan hatched by a conservative ally from another borough and the new Brooklyn head to remove the city's two strongest bosses, a plan that collapsed when their chosen instrument went straight to the targets. That twist sent the ally into crisis. cost the Brooklyn head his job and a fine, and lifted the emissary from loyal soldier to leader overnight. It also showed how the principles the old man had lived by, avoid cameras, seek steady profit, keep deals in small rooms, were already slipping in a city that now rewarded people who learned to manage headlines. To understand why his way stuck so long, it helps to walk back through his early years. He came to New York in 1921 and tried his first steps in America the way many immigrants did. Small trade, small loans, small failures, small lessons. Some accounts say he spent time in the Midwest and opened a grocery that did not last, then returned to Brooklyn with a clearer sense of where his skills could pay. In the mid-1920s, he founded an importing business and began moving olive oil and other staples to grocers who spoke his language and trusted his manners. He took pride in clean deliveries and careful books. He matched that effort with another, less public one. The Prohibition years had created a vast market for risk. He met men who handled that risk and learned to balance the two economies, one with invoices and the other with nods. When the city's old power structure tore itself apart in 1930 and 1931, he survived by avoiding dramatics. He stayed out of the line of fire while larger names battled. When peace came and the reorganization put 5 recognized heads atop the major boroughs, he held one of the seats. He brought to that table a style that suited the moment. Business had to replace brawling. Arguments had to end in votes, not street scenes. He valued the Sicilian network of kin, village ties, and church life that bound his circle together. He often backed the conservative wing when matters came up for decision. His allies shared his dislike of spectacle and his instinct for avoiding new heat in a city where law enforcement had begun looking over financial records as closely as they looked over barroom doors. He invested in the kinds of rackets that had built the New York underworld ever since the turn of the century. Number slips passed through candy stores and newsstands. Card rooms opened after dinner. Dice tables appeared in basements. Street loans went to barbers, tailors, and grocers shut out of bank credit. Trucking businesses that moved garments, produce, and dry goods learned to make space for chosen carriers. Union elections were eased toward results that kept schedules working and labor peace intact. The lines between licit and illicit profits overlapped, and that overlap was his strength. If one stream slowed, another carried the weight. If a police raid closed a room, a supply contract added margin. Because he kept all this under the cover of a respected import firm and a spotless demeanor at church, he could point to respectable accounts whenever pressure rose. Reporters gave him a nickname that stuck, the Olive Oil King. That title fit his storefront and masked the rest. Behind the counter, his lieutenants handled numbers, collections, gambling rosters, and loan books. They also coordinated with men on the docks and in markets. He preferred detail to bravado. He visited warehouses, learned routes by heart, and asked drivers about small delays. Those habits mattered later, when younger men tried to seize parts of the system. He knew, from memory, where value lived, and how to shut off a drip before it became a leak. Tax cases became the main legal tool used against him. In the early 1950s, a federal grand jury returned indictments, accusing him of hiding income and filing false returns. He answered with lawyers and doctors. Medical records showed operations and recurring stomach trouble. Judges granted postponements. Trials drifted. Some counts fell away. Others lingered, without a clean conclusion. He cultivated patience as a tactic. Every day a case did not finish was a day he could continue running his affairs and adjusting the business to new conditions. At no point did he let a microphone catch him, answering a question he did not need to answer. Appalachian in 1957 forced him, with many others, into a spotlight he had avoided. State police stumbled into a meeting at a quiet property and broke up a lunch where bosses from several cities had gathered to talk about money, rules, and friction. He was among those questioned. He said he was visiting friends. Investigators did not believe him, but they lacked charges that would hold. The fallout increased pressure everywhere. For him, the lesson he already believed was underlined in bold. Visibility was the enemy of profit. He tightened meetings, tightened messaging, and redoubled gifts to parishes and schools that could affirm his image as a benefactor. Inside his house, the rebellion that later carried into the era after his death had roots in his insistence on regular tribute. The policy required crews to send a fixed envelope and to treat that duty as non-negotiable. He explained it as the price of order. Some men accepted the rationale, others hardened. The feud with the Gallo brothers reached open confrontation after a major earner in their orbit, a numbers boss known for big routes and big talk, was eliminated in 1959. The younger crew expected to inherit the roots they had helped protect. The old man reassigned the most valuable parts to older captains, linked by marriage and decades of service. That move set off a chain of refusals, grabs, and retaliations. Kidnappings followed. Ransoms were demanded. A temporary peace was bought, then withdrawn. An attempted strangling at a neighborhood lounge, broken up by a uniformed patrolman who stepped through the door at the wrong moment for the attackers, turned a simmer into a boil. Street figures changed sides. One clever lieutenant who had gained the old man's trust tipped toward the rebels, then shifted back, earning a nickname that spoke to his habit of sliding between camps when it suited him. Age, and the sickness that had given him cover in federal court, finally took him in 1962. He died with his family near, and the church he had supported for years filled for his funeral. The city sent cameras. Detectives filled notebooks with names. Priests spoke of devotion and charity. Nothing in the homily mentioned rackets, dues, or sit-downs. They did not need to. Everyone on those steps knew they were saying goodbye to a man whose power had been as real as his piety. The structure he left behind continued as he had planned. His brother handled figures. His brother-in-law took the chair. The feud with the Gallos cooled when a key brother went to prison on an extortion case and heated again whenever the others felt they were being shorted. The commission watched and pressed for quiet. Then came the plot that would stamp the family with a new name. The conservative ally from another borough worked with the new Brooklyn head on a plan to remove the city's two dominant bosses. They picked as their instrument a young captain who seemed loyal, ambitious, and able. He went straight to the intended targets and repeated every detail. The commission acted. The Brooklyn head was fined and told to retire. The ally lost his place. The messenger received the chair. Reporters started using his name for the family. Under that new label, the old feud carried on, and the city adjusted to a rising wave of attention that the old man had done everything to avoid. Years later, when a federal witness described the underworld structure to a Senate committee, he named the old man as one of the longtime members of the top council, a figure who had favored rules and revenue over theatrics. That description matched the way people in his borough had always seen him. He liked contracts and routines more than he liked stunts. He favored stability over conquest. He tried to keep the drug traffic at arm's length because it brought heat he did not want. He made room for kin and old friends. He reinforced his circle with marriage ties. He treated some donations as spiritual duty and some as smart optics. He answered questions with nods and never with speeches. He paid lawyers and accountants to make sure his footprint looked lawful when outsiders stared at it. If you walk the old streets in Brooklyn where his trucks once paused, people still tell stories that mix the ordinary with the hidden. A grocer remembers an early delivery, stacked crates, and a gentle reminder to pay on time. A retired driver remembers a route that ran like a watch because someone at the top knew every corner. A parish volunteer remembers a check brought in a plain envelope and a whispered request to fix the roof before winter. A detective remembers sitting in a car for hours, watching a door that opened to nobody important until suddenly it did. These are the small truths that make his larger truth easier to see. He built a system that made money by being reliable, and he protected it by being discreet. The later wars that shook the group after the name changed the renewed conflict when the paroled rebel returned in the early 1970s, the public rallies by the new boss, the camera shots that would have made the old man wince. The controversy and violence that followed were part of a different era. Yet even those events carried the old imprint. The grievances that fueled them were old grievances about shares and respect. The markets at issue were the same markets he had helped knit together. The people who tried to claim authority argued about the same rules he had taught. Who could tax whom? Who could sit at which table? And how borders should be drawn between crews. In that sense, His story continued long after his coffin slid into the wall in Queens. His decisions, good and bad, kept writing headlines in a city that had learned his name years earlier through a shop window lined with green glass and a man who counted quietly while the street outside fell into night. By the late 1960s, the map he had drawn still guided men who had never shaken his hand. Crews rotated collections, as if the notebook on his desk remained open. Old captains told new recruits the same lines he liked to repeat: keep your voice low, keep your roots tight, return calls, make deposits on time, and act like tomorrow matters more than today. Those sentences had carried him from a small storefront to a long run at the top. They kept feeding families long after he left the stage. People usually remember a boss by the loudest moments around him, but with him the quieter details tell more. He chose businesses that blended with the city's daily life. Olive oil and tomato paste shipments to grocery shelves. Trucks pulling in before daybreak to drop sacks of produce. Coin-operated machines in luncheonettes. Vending contracts in factory break rooms. Routes in the garment district that moved dresses from cut to rack. Those legitimate streams earned him handshakes with store owners and a reputation for punctuality. Layered under them were the classic rackets that gave the structure its muscle. Numbers slips passing across candy counters, card and dice rooms that opened after dinner, collections from merchants who wanted calm nights and unstained windows, loans to shopkeepers who had no bank to turn to, and leverage over union calendars that kept deliveries smooth. The point was never drama. The point was a predictable week. That insistence on routine made him conservative at the commission table. When the 5 families met after the old war to regularize disputes, he stood with the elders who wanted non-violent arbitration, simple borders, and fines instead of headlines. He disliked brash power plays. He considered them wasteful. That caution won him allies among bosses who recognized in him a man who treasured revenue above ego. It also built up friction with younger men inside his own family, who wanted looser levies and faster promotions. In his mind, restraint was the secret to longevity. In theirs, restraint was a brake that kept them from their turn at the wheel. He built defenses to match his temperament. Lawyers and accountants tightened the paper that covered his businesses. Warehouses were incorporated correctly. Vehicles were properly titled. Offices paid taxes and filed registrations that matched what an inspector expected to see. When agents pressed, he could point to files and invoices. When prosecutors leaned on witnesses, they ran into relatives and old friends who had learned the same lesson he had learned in Sicily and brought to Brooklyn. Keep your counsel. The cases that stuck were tax counts that accused him of hiding income. He turned those into calendars and continuances, with a steady stream of medical notes and patient lawyering. Delays stacked up. The clock bought him time, and time was the commodity he valued most. In the years right after the famous upstate raid, pressure on everyone increased. Agents watched waterfronts, union halls, and back rooms. They took pictures of license plates and assembled charts. They listened to pay phones and compared customs records with street gossip. In that spotlight, he shrank his meetings to kitchens and swings in back gardens. He used his chapel as a daily refuge, carried a rosary as if it were a pocket watch, and kept giving to parishes that needed repairs or new statues. Priests spoke warmly of his generosity. Parish bulletins carried thanks. Friends mentioned the calm, serious way he prayed. Skeptics called it image work. With him, it was both belief and shield. He did not mind people arguing about motives. He minded ledgers, not commentary. The fight with the Gallo crew showed how his rules met a new generation's pride. He levied a fixed take from each crew. He framed an extra slice as charity that would go to religious causes. Some welcomed that as a pious tradition in a community built around parish life. Others saw a levy dressed up in sacred cloth. Resentment smoldered after a prominent numbers earner in the Gallo orbit was eliminated in 1959. His roots went not to the men who had done the heavy lift, but to older captains bound to the top by long ties. The younger faction balked, then grabbed hostages to force change. He bargained, offered relief, retrieved his people, and then restored his old terms. He believed that order could not survive a bad precedent. The attempted strangling at a neighborhood lounge months later, interrupted by a patrolman's entrance, proved that the quarrel had turned into a test of stamina. He kept his voice level. They raised theirs. He waited for time to do its work. It did, but illness stepped in before he could finish the job on his terms. When he died in June 1962, the succession he had mapped went into effect. Joseph Magliocco, his brother Yinyolo and longtime deputy, took the chair. For a few months, the family moved, as if nothing had changed. Then the outer world pressed in. A thoughtful, ambitious ally from another borough approached Magliocco with a scheme to rebalance the commission by eliminating its two strongest figures. The ally believed that only a dramatic move could counter his rival's rise. Magliocco agreed. They tapped a young captain to help. That captain, who had earned a reputation for tact and clean earnings, informed the targets. The commission called Magliocco to account, imposed a fine, demanded he retire, and spared him worse because he was old and sick. He left the chair and died soon after. The ally fled and saw his own power unravel. The messenger, remarkably, was elevated to the top with the commission's blessing. With that, the city's papers swapped the family's label to his surname. The old man's creation would be known by that new name ever after. The rename did not rewrite the blueprint. The same portfolio still spun: loans, numbers, gambling rooms, market and garment influence, vending routes, trucking lines, and the importing firm that continued to supply neighborhood shelves. The collection schedule did not change. The old levy, resented or accepted, stayed in place. The alliance with conservative figures on the commission persisted, although now it included the very man who had revealed the plot. What changed was the public face. The new boss formed a civic league, held rallies, gave interviews, and turned himself into a symbol of ethnic pride to protest the way media used a single charged word to describe Italian-American communities. That campaign put cameras on a family that had once lived by avoiding them. It made many older men uncomfortable. It would end in a public tragedy that shook the city and reset the balance again. The old man would have considered the entire spectacle wasteful risk, proof of the danger of courting attention. To understand his place in the underworld more completely, consider how witnesses later described the commission's inner dynamics. A federal informant told senators in 1963 that there was a standing board to resolve disputes, and that one seat had been his for decades. That testimony sketched him as a quiet conservative who liked money to flow and blood to stay in rumors, not on sidewalks. It matched the way his crew heads had experienced him: exacting about tribute, stern about schedules, and slow to approve expansions that smelled like heat. He preferred fields he could understand: food distribution, trucking routes tied to specific markets, vending and jukebox placements, betting where the clients were known by first name. He distrusted flamboyant ventures that required publicity or drew crowds he could not predict. His deeper talent sat in the way he knit family ties into business. He put brothers, nephews, and in-laws into positions where they served as both bonds and buffers. Those relatives were not always stars, but they were reliable. They could be counted on to keep their mouths shut and to honor the family's way of doing things. He used marriages to strengthen connections with allied figures inside and outside the borough. That web let him control assets without always appearing to. If a warehouse contract landed with a cousin's company, or a vending route went to a brother's friend, the top could keep its hands clean on paper while still making the big choices. That is why when he died, prosecutors found tidy files and few loose threads. He had never trusted loose threads. There is a paradox at the center of his legacy. He built through caution and ritual, two qualities that rarely make headlines. Yet the aftershocks of his policy choices created some of the most visible episodes in the history of the New York underworld. His insistence on tribute set off disputes that filled newspapers years after he was gone. His alliance with conservative bosses, meant to prevent chaos, helped spur a desperate plot by others who felt cornered. The plot backfired and created a leader who embraced cameras. That leader's public activism drew attention he would never have tolerated and invited a crowd to a rally where a gunman changed the city's conversation in an instant. From his point of view, each of those moments was proof that the only safe strategy was the old one. Steady profit, small rooms, quiet correction. Because he prized discretion, many of his crimes were the kind police list rather than photograph. He ran numbers through small shops. He made money from illegal card and dice games. He collected protection. He charged interest at rates that kept debtors punctual. He used union contacts to steer contracts and soothe labor disputes in ways that favored his warehouses, trucks, and partners. He was suspected of sanctioning retaliations when people reneged. He was linked by law enforcement to a handful of removals that reset lines in his favor, including the end of the loud numbers boss whose route started the Gallo Revolt. He was accused of hiding income and filing false tax returns. He spent time under indictment. He deployed delays in medical records to blunt the cases. None of those counts carried him to a long sentence. By the standards of his world, that made him successful. He wanted to keep his life measured in meetings, not in years behind bars. He treated narcotics as the kind of heat that could scorch an entire house. Publicly and in private counsel, he discouraged it. Investigators believed some members of his organization, like members of every large family, touched the traffic anyway. That was the reality of a sprawling network that included independent men with their own ideas of risk. He tried to keep those choices at the edges, away from the center of his brand, because he knew that narcotics brought federal task forces and a different level of scrutiny. His preference was always for rackets that could be explained away as hustles tied to everyday commerce. He never claimed heroism or romance for any of it. He thought in ledgers: cost, return, risk, schedule. He wore the same suits and kept the same hours year after year. He maintained a home where grandchildren laughed, and Italian was spoken with old vowels and new slang. He went to mass and gave to parishes that needed roofs fixed or pews repaired. He shook hands with neighbors who knew him as a polite man, who kept a tidy property and meant his greetings. That domestic image mattered to him as much as his business standing. It helped explain why witnesses did not line up to speak against him. They saw an immigrant success story that had fed many tables. They understood the other story too, but they did not feel like starring in it. When historians weigh his life, they return to three measurements. First, longevity. From the early 1920s to 1962, he remained a factor through Prohibition, a civil war in the underworld, a post-war boom, and the birth of televised scrutiny. Second, structure. He built a hybrid portfolio that gave him plausible deniability and real leverage. Third, style. He married piety to prudence and used both to keep pressure low. Those traits explain why the family he created did not fall apart when his name left the letterhead. They also explain why frustration built under him. A system that prizes calm and dues can feel like a closed door to ambitious men in their 30s. The Gallo saga is the plainest proof of that friction. Years after his death, when a new generation of prosecutors used wiretaps and racketeering laws to go after his successors, they still found echoes of his voice in the rules men quoted to one another. No swearing on the phone, no lateness with envelopes, no meetings that include more than a handful of men, no mixing of personal showboats with business, no noise in front of civilians. They learned those rules from men who had learned them from him. That is the measure he would have cared about most. The paper at the courthouse mattered less than the calendar in the back office. If the calendar kept its rhythm, he counted it a win. He did not live to see the years when cameras and courtrooms grew sharper. He did not see the league rallies by the man who replaced his name at the top. He did not watch the public shock that followed a summer afternoon in Columbus Circle, or the headlines that flowed after a lady night shooting in a Little Italy restaurant, or the long federal trials that defined the 1980s. He left before those chapters, and yet his handwriting appears in the margins of each one. The markets, the routes, the way people addressed one another, the expectations around tribute and territory, those were his. In a city that forgets yesterday quickly, that is a rare legacy. Routines that outlast the man who wrote them, good or ill. Steady as a ledger line that keeps reappearing when you think the book has closed. Years rolled on, and the city kept telling two versions of him at once. In one, he was a quiet merchant who prayed early, worked late, and kept shelves stocked with jars and bottles that made dinners taste like home. In the other, he was a patient organizer who built a network that reached from corner stores to union halls, from loading docks to backroom card tables. Both portraits were true together. That blend explains why his way lasted. It fit daily life so well that people could carry it forward without thinking about who had written the rules. Men who came up under his captains used his phrases long after he was gone. They spoke about punctual envelopes and clean ledgers. They reminded one another not to crowd a room, and not to repeat names on a phone. They learned that real strength looked like predictability, not volume. Those habits seeped into everything. The times trucks left a warehouse, the rhythm of collection days, the speed of a reply when a store owner called about a problem on a route. If a driver was late twice, he was replaced. If a borrower wanted a break, he got one once, not twice. If a union steward needed a favor, he got it in a form that left no paper trail. That was the culture he planted. His legal front kept paying. The importing firm had a brand that showed up on family tables all across the boroughs. It had contracts with grocers and restaurants. It had space in warehouses and a neat fleet of trucks. Beneath that, his crews ran the city's everyday gambling economy. Number sheets moved through newsstands and candy counters. Dice and cards came out after closing time. Short-term loans kept small businesses afloat at rates designed to make lateness too expensive to try. The collection side of the enterprise offered insurance that kept windows unbroken and truck tires uncut. On the labor front, friendly voices helped settle disputes and steer contracts toward chosen carriers. None of that was flashy. All of it added up. He had chosen allies who shared his taste for order. He got along with bosses who preferred talks to tantrums, men who believed money should not be endangered by pride. He leaned especially close to leaders from the same island where he was born, men who brought the same village habits to New York. Respect for family, patience in dispute, and a strong preference for resolving problems inside the house. That alignment shaped votes at the council table. It also shaped the way he reacted when someone in his own ranks pushed back. He met defiance with a steady demand for dues and a refusal to let exceptions become rules. The clash with the Gallo faction showed how that strategy could hold and strain at the same time. After the loudest numbers man in their orbit was removed in 1959, the younger crew believed they would take over his richest policy banks. He reassigned much of that wealth to older hands tied to him by marriage and years of loyalty. The younger men balked. They withheld tribute, held hostages, forced talks, accepted a truce, then watched him restore his old terms. The result was a long standoff that produced street scenes no one wanted, including a strangling attempt in a dim lounge that ended when a patrolman stepped through the door. Throughout, he stayed consistent. No public show, no capitulation, and no sentimental attachment to anyone who could not keep the schedule he set. Investigators tried to break him with numbers rather than street cases. They accused him of hiding income and filing false returns. He answered with lawyers, medical records, and time. Judges granted adjournments. Trials stalled. Some counts dissolved. Others lingered. He had structured his businesses so that invoices and contracts could absorb a hard look. Warehouses were in order. Corporations filed on time. Vehicles were listed correctly. That made it harder for a stranger to draw a straight line from a candy store's cash drawer to the man who ran the whole thing. It frustrated agents, but it was the point. He had designed the system to make clean lines unlikely. At home, he lived as if the outside noise were a rumor. He kept a small chapel alight. He sent money to parishes that needed repairs. He took part in religious processions and joined fraternal groups that met for dinners and raised funds for good works. People remembered him kneeling with a measured calm, as if he could set the day's tempo by the way he bowed his head. Those same people understood, without being told, that he did not like being crossed in business. They held those two images together without strain because that was how their neighborhoods worked. A man could be devout and demanding in the same week, the same day, even the same hour. The upstate raid in 1957 showed the country a snapshot of the network he helped sustain. Cars lined a country road. Officers took down names. He was among those questioned. He said he had been visiting friends. The public realized that men who lived far apart met to coordinate money and rules. That revelation did not stop the machinery. It did change the temperature. Agents watched more closely. Editors wrote more stories. He tightened things further, moved meetings to safer places, and built in more buffers between himself and the moving parts. His death in 1962 ended his personal involvement, but not the rulebook. His brother-in-law took charge, then lost the chair in the wake of a plot that reflected a larger chess game among the families. The young captain who became the new boss did something the old man would never have done. He invited cameras. He created a civic group, stood at podiums, and spoke to crowds about dignity and stereotype. The news loved it. The sudden visibility brought both sympathy and danger. A daytime shooting at a public rally in 1971 silenced the new boss and plunged the family into a fresh period of turmoil. Old resentments returned. The younger rebels who had fought with the old man a decade earlier found themselves in the middle of another storm. One brother, newly paroled, walked Little Italy at night and drew attention he had always courted. He died in a burst of gunfire at a seafood place crowded with late diners. The headlines grew loud. The old man's ghost would have shaken his head. These were exactly the risks he had spent a life avoiding. New tools remade the legal landscape. In 1970, Congress passed a racketeering law that let prosecutors treat a criminal organization's pattern of acts as a single offense. Wiretaps improved. Hidden microphones multiplied. Cases could be built from calendars, coded chatter, and the memory of a single ledger entry read aloud on a grainy tape. The structure he had helped formalize in 1931, the council, the flow of tribute. The shared investments now served as evidence in sweeping trials. In the mid-1980s, a case that targeted the board itself brought long sentences to leaders across the city, including the head of the Brooklyn family who had risen after the era of rallies and street feuds. That outcome showed how the order that once protected revenue had become an easier target for modern prosecutors. Even with those changes, traces of him kept surfacing. When agents played tapes of captains speaking in quiet rooms, they heard the same phrases he had used. They heard older men explain dues with the same logic. They heard cautions in the same cadence. Do not say names. Do not rush. Do not call back from that phone. They heard talk about keeping narcotics at arm's length because heat from that traffic could burn every other business. They heard complaints from younger men about levies that felt too heavy and promotions that moved too slowly. Time had passed. The language had not. Anyone looking for a list of what he did wrong would find a roster typical of his era. He ran numbers through small shops. He supported illegal card and dice games. He collected from people who paid for calm. He lent at hard rates. He used union influence to direct contracts, speed, schedules, and remove obstacles. He sanctioned retaliations when someone broke a promise, and a quiet example had to be set. He attended a meeting upstate that lawmen called a summit. He faced federal indictments for tax offenses and fought them with procedural patience. He appointed relatives and old friends to roles that blurred the line between kinship and business. He wrapped himself in faith, partly from belief and partly from caution. He did all this without seeking a microphone or a headline. In his mind, that restraint limited damage. In practice, it extended his run. It is easy to mistake restraint for softness. He was not soft. He was strategic. He understood that the least expensive way to win an argument was to make sure the argument never became public. He understood that a container arriving on time and a driver hitting every stop did more to build power than a dramatic act one night on a crowded corner. He learned those lessons in Sicily, where patience and caution were survival skills, and he applied them in a city that rewarded urgency but punished exposure. When the underworld shifted toward a generation that prized speed and spectacle, he was already gone. The reaction to that shift, new laws, new cases, new headlines, confirmed his old instinct. His name faded from the family's letterhead, but it stayed in textbooks and legal files. Scholars examining the transition from prohibition to the post-war order point to him as a prime example of how a leader could blend a respectable business with hidden control of rackets. They note his alliance with conservative figures at the council table. They study the way he used kinship to fortify his center. They highlight his conflict with the gallows as a turning point that forecast the generational struggles of the 1960s and 1970s. They also underline the paradox of his public piety sincere, by most accounts, and his private enforcement unyielding, by every account. That tension made him memorable. Neighbors remember simpler things: a wave from a stoop, a child given a few coins for candy after church, a delivery truck backed into a narrow driveway with a driver who knew how to move without scraping a brick, a smell of tomatoes and garlic drifting from a warehouse door, a quiet man in a dark suit lingering in the last pew before slipping out a side door. Those memories survive because they are ordinary. They show how thoroughly he embedded himself in the city's daily life. His power hid in plain sight. inside routines that no one thought of as dramatic because they were not. When you step back and look at the result, you see a long arc that begins with an immigrant and ends with a house style. The style prizes punctuality, discipline, and privacy. It makes money in small, steady ways. It resists risk that demands public attention. It uses respect for ritual, religious, familial, and business as a binding agent. It punishes betrayal without theater. It teaches its members to keep busy and keep quiet. That was his gift to the people who came after him. It helped some avoid prison longer than they might have otherwise. It frustrated others who wanted to climb faster. It made the family he built resilient enough to endure name changes, court cases, and public shocks. He did not write a memoir. He did not give interviews. What he left behind are choices that kept repeating. Choices that grew into habits that still shape stories told in kitchens and on sidewalks. The city has a short memory for everything except routine. A truck rolling before dawn looks the same in 1,948 and 1,968 and 1,988. A grocer signing for a delivery does not think about who runs the company that supplied it. A parish roof repaired before winter does not tell you whose check paid for the shingles. That was the point. He wanted a life that could blend into the street while guiding it. For decades, he had that life. The blueprint endures in traces you can still find if you watch the way a long day starts in a quiet neighborhood and ends with lights going dark behind a clean shop window. And that was the story of Joe Profaci, the olive oil king, who ruled with a blend of charm, cunning, and quiet power. His empire left its mark on history, but tonight, it becomes just another shadow fading into the silence. Thank you for spending these moments with me here at the Silent Empires. Don't forget to share your city and the time you're listening down in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories travel. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss another tale of gangsters and empires long gone. Sleep peacefully, dream deeply, and good night.